Good afternoon. Thank you for coming back this afternoon. We have a couple of really interesting and exciting panels and some important closing remarks this afternoon, so we're very pleased to see you. Before we get started, I want to invite Darian Swig back up here for just a moment for a very interesting and exciting announcement from the city of San Francisco.
Yeah, I know.
Thank you. This is sort of hot off the press, so to speak. Yesterday evening, and it was just finalized this morning, the San Francisco Board of Supervisors just approved the adoption of the Responsibility to Protect resolution, and they have written here, which I have authorized, that the Board of Supervisors of the City and County of San Francisco strongly urge the President and Congress to commit the leadership of the United States government to effective implementation of the World Summit Outcome Declaration on the Responsibility to Protect. And that was official and signed today. So it's a start, and that makes 2 cities, 1 state, and a few others to go. Thank you.
Thank you, Darian. I really want to congratulate and thank Darian on her efforts to push this through the Board of Supervisors and Bevan Duffy's office. Welcome back. I will ask you one more time just to check your cell phones, make sure they're turned off if you had them on earlier. We have the restrooms in the back and also on the first floor. I know there was sort of a backup earlier today, so that's another option. And also, when we come to the question and answer period, if you wouldn't mind using the handheld mic, we'll have someone to come around with that. We're delighted to have such distinguished guests here this afternoon to participate on the panel, to be moderated by Donald Steinberg. Don is the Vice President for Multilateral Affairs and directs the New York office of the International Crisis Group, the same group of which Gareth Evans is a president, from whom you heard this morning. He's been a really tremendous member of the conference steering committee and has offered many wise words of advice about putting the program together, and we really appreciate all of his efforts for the conference and for R2P overall. Welcome, Don.
Thank you. No, you have to wait till I've spoken to clap. So it really is a great honor to be here today to talk about the process of pushing ahead the concept of responsibility to protect, and to be among so many friends and colleagues who have taken this on. For me, this is a very important conceptual change in how the international community views itself, and it is also very deeply personal. On April 6, 1994, I had been in my position as Bill Clinton's advisor for Africa for all of about a week when the plane carrying the presidents of Burundi and Rwanda was shot down outside of Kigali, which sparked that genocide that killed some 800,000 Rwandans. We did not realize when it first occurred what was going on. We thought that this was a spontaneous bloodletting, but it became very clear within about 3 to 4 weeks that this was a planned, systematic exercise in extermination. I will always regret that I bought into the common wisdom at that time that after Somalia and the Black Hawk Down incident, the American people would not abide sending U.S. troops to another remote African location. But there was much that we could have done short of sending U.S. forces to save lives there. For example, we could have jammed the hate language on the radio station Mil Colleen. We could have reinforced Romeo Dallaire's forces with equipment and with other forms of support. We could have pressed for new UN or African peacekeepers to save as many lives as possible. But every time some of us within government would be proposing these ideas, others would push back, and they would say, where's the legal basis for this action? Where's the public outcry, the hallelujah chorus of support for this action? Where's the evidence to show that these actions will actually stop the killings? And you may not recall, but indeed there were very few voices in civil society, on college campuses, in the media, or in Congress calling for anything beyond simple humanitarian relief. And in fact, there was very little ground truth to inform our actions. And so when we talked about the idea of jamming the radio station, for example, we were caught in a discussion with lawyers who said that this is illegal under international law. When we decided to provide 50 armored personnel carriers for Romeo Dallaire's forces, we were told that we couldn't provide them because they were painted green and they had to be painted white. And we actually had to ship them back from Kampala, where they were scheduled to go into Rwanda, back to Germany to repaint them, because the argument was that the Americans had to repaint these. When we proposed new peacekeepers to go out to Rwanda, the point was made moot by the fact that there were no ready trained forces, but especially it was made moot by the fact that we didn't have legal and financial mechanisms to actually allow this to occur. And so time and time again, the voices of inaction triumphed until the genocide actually burned itself out. It was this failure of will and the failed international responses previously to Somalia and subsequently to Bosnia that I believed formed the roots of the concept of responsibility to protect. And following the outstanding work on the ICISS, I believe it was in the ashes of the World Trade Center that the American people finally came to understand as never before the stakes at play for us. The interlink between chaos abroad and terrorism, trafficking in drugs, arms, and persons, pandemic diseases, and other threats to international order. And so our discussion here today is not some idle foreign policy primer, but it actually is going to help determine what our priorities are in the future, and it builds on the remarkable work of the ICISS, the dedicated work of governments, NGOs, and international civil servants to bring the R2P language into the World Summit and the subsequent Security Council resolutions, and the effort to press the R2P concept publicly. We've come a long way, but the situation in Darfur indeed reminds us how far we still have to go. Whether you believe that the R2P concept justifies non-consensual military intervention or not, it is clear that the international community has blinked in the face of its responsibility to protect the people of that region. I was part of the U.S. government task force that investigated on behalf of Secretary Powell whether this was in fact genocide occurring in Darfur, and we came to the clear conclusion based upon interview after interview on the ground that indeed it was genocide, and so we made that declaration. But that has failed to show, that has failed to show the results that we had hoped. The United States has failed to implement its own supported UN resolutions to create a no-fly zone, to target sanctions, to proceed with any more than just a few ICC indictments, seemingly allowing the proponents of state sovereignty to again trump the right of individuals to international protection. And in this case, we can't argue that this all happened so quickly that we didn't have time to react. In Darfur, what we're talking about is a slow-motion genocide. And so the challenge that we faced in Rwanda remains unchanged today: how to build a permanent, deliverable, broad-based, and politically potent constituency for American and international engagement in the face of global atrocities. I think, as Richard Cooper said this morning, this question cuts to the core of who we are as a nation and who we are as individuals. If it were easy, it wouldn't require the kind of brain power and dedication and experience that we have in this room right now. But I'm convinced that when we leave here after the next couple of days, we'll go forth with a new commitment and a new energy to make this vision a reality, and that a decade or so from now, we'll all be talking about the Berkeley Conference as an important step in the process of building R2P. I wanted to also just take a brief moment to comment on Romeo Dallaire's question from earlier about where within the UN system in particular this responsibility rests. I would argue that indeed it does rest with the humanitarian coordinator. It rests with the special advisor for the prevention of genocide, a role that has been served so admirably by Juan Mendez, who I guess is in the room at this point, although I can't see him. There he is. So the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, I would say that every special representative for the Secretary General needs to take this on. We went the entire morning talking about the fact that what we're really talking about is the responsibility to protect women in large part, because they are the principal victims of all the crimes that we've been talking about. And so it's absolutely essential that UNIFEM and other gender organizations get involved, children as well, and so the Special Representative for Children in Armed Conflict. But when you wrap it all up, the leadership has to come from the Secretary General. And unless Ban Ki-moon sends the same kind of signals that Kofi Annan was sending about the importance of this initiative, a lot of the impetus will be lost. Gareth Evans and I have had the opportunity to meet with Ban Ki-moon 3 times over the past 3 months, and each time we've talked about the importance of responsibility to protect. He has indeed endorsed this as one of the key principles, and now the rubber's got to meet the road, and he's got to make this a practical instruction to all of his servants within the UN system, and we're going to be pressing for that to occur. I was actually just supposed to be up here moderating, and I apologize for seeking the podium, but what I would like to do now is to introduce our panel, and it is indeed a remarkable panel, people I've respected and been working with for many, many years. Leading off will be Lee Feinstein, who will talk a little bit about the development within the United States of this concept and what it means looking towards the future. Lee and I actually share a lot of things, including the fact that we were both the principal deputy within policy planning at the State Department, and Lee was my predecessor, and I still resent the fact that he took all of the best equipment with him when he left. Tori Holt is, again, someone I've respected for many, many years, and on top of her distinguished service for the U.S. government, in particular the State Department, she has now turned the Stimson Center into R2P South, if New York was perceived as R2P North. And indeed, Garrett's mentioning and others mentioning of the book that she has just written, and I hope she'll plug it today, which talks about some of the military side of this. Again, when the rubber really meets the road, how do you actually do this? And she'll talk as well about a fascinating conference that she organized with military commanders who are actually doing this on the ground and telling us a little bit about how that would work. I have to confess that I did not know Mr. Katsumi before today, the one person on our panel who is not a good friend, but he is now. And he will be talking about Japan and how you address these issues in a different environment. He has long experience working with civil society in Japan, currently as an advisor to a senior member of the parliament there, and also a very proud history of supporting the International Criminal Court. And perhaps some of the lessons from that exercise will become clear. And then Hans-Jörg Strohmeyer, who just recently became the Chief of Policy Development at the Office of the Coordinator for Humanitarian Affairs, but has incredible experience in addressing these issues. His list of countries where he has served in sounds like the list of conflict areas throughout the 1990s, including Sudan, Liberia, East Timor, Kosovo, and Bosnia. And he'll talk a little bit about how the responsibility to protect fits into the larger question of how do we protect civilians around the world in these sorts of situations. So again, I've asked each of the panelists to speak for 8 to 10, 12 minutes, and then we'll have some time for some questions. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Don, and welcome everybody. It's a real honor to be on this panel. I think the big lesson of today and this effort is that good ideas, even profound ones like the responsibility to protect, don't sell themselves. And it requires a lot of follow-up work and the idea of propounding the message. And we have here today people who have really not just written the outline for the responsibility to protect, but also taken it upon themselves to follow through. And I'd like to recognize Gareth and Don and Heidi and Dick Cooper, among others, for really taking that responsibility very seriously. So I think I'm here to give the perspective from the nation's navel, and I will try to do so. I work at the Council on Foreign Relations, and as Don said, I worked both at the Pentagon in the Peacekeeping Office, which was a new office at that time, and when the United States rallied to protect the people of Rwanda, in 1994 and 95, and then subsequently in the State Department, where I worked for Secretary Christopher and Secretary Albright. Since that time, I've had an opportunity to work on this issue in the context of the UN, and I think several of you, I will plug my report is out on a table called Darfur and Beyond, What is Needed to Prevent Mass Atrocities. And it's meant to be the theory and practice, or an introduction, let's say, to the theory and practice of the responsibility to protect what its political significance is, and then some recommendations for the United Nations, for the United States, for NATO and the European Union, as well as the African Union, on how to follow through both militarily but also in a whole range of other areas. I guess the fundamental thesis here is, and an alternative title to this report might be Beyond Bullets, because I think the goal is to try to avoid the circumstance where the choices are doing nothing or sending in the Marines. I think that's the goal, to avoid those stark choices, and I think the responsibility to protect is sometimes caricatured by those who criticize it as being a doctrine for the use of military force. And of course there are elements of the responsibility to protect which address that, but it's a much more detailed and comprehensive plan. And in fact what it really says is two things, and I think the first element is overlooked. The first and fundamental responsibility is on states not to do genocide or to acquiesce in genocide or look the other way. That's the first and most fundamental principle. And the idea here is to change the mindset of leaders so that when they consider engaging in a mass atrocity, that they also have to measure what the consequences might be they political, economic, diplomatic, or otherwise. And the second part of the responsibility to protect is on the rest of us to respond, not necessarily to send in the Marines, but to act. And as Gareth and others have said, preferably to act early and effectively. And also not necessarily against a government, but in the first instance and wherever possible with the government. And there are a whole range of areas where that can take place, and there are studies underway at the UN to look at the cooperative areas where one can work with governments where there are concerns in order to avert a genuine crisis. The interesting thing about the responsibility to protect in the American context is how long its legs have been. It was released right around the time of 9/11, and I think many people at the time thought it would be relegated to a well-intentioned period piece, sort of the Bill Clinton space between the Cold War and the attacks on New York. But surprisingly, that has not been the case. And I would give three principal reasons for why this issue has gained a certain degree of traction, although there's still quite a lot of ambivalence, also quite a lot of ignorance of the issue as well. First is that the Bush administration took on a failed state analysis in very much the same way that the Clinton administration before it had outlined it as part of its globalization strategy. And the failed state analysis, as most of you in this room would know, is essentially that failed states matter, and that what goes wrong or can go wrong in failed states can have very direct consequences for American national security. And the Bush administration outlined this in its national security strategy of 2003, which was much more famous for other things, including the statement of preemption as an element of American national security policy. The other thing I would say, and I discuss this briefly in the report, is that in a period after 9/11 when of catastrophic terrorism, when weapons of mass destruction are not the monopoly of states, there has been a general tendency to try to frown on self-help. The United States and other nations and the high-level panel as well endorsed a definition, a comprehensive definition of terrorism that does not justify terrorism as defined, whatever the cause, just or not. And in that environment, in an environment where self-help is seen as potentially dangerous and hard to control, the responsibility to protect actually gives a recourse, an international recourse, to citizens, individuals in countries that have legitimate concerns. The third reason it has had traction is because it has cross-ideological appeal. I noticed I did not use the word bipartisan. If I do, somebody should raise their hand and tell me not to use it. It's cross-ideological. The responsibility to protect has attracted the support of people in this room who are, I will be presumptuous to say, more or less liberal internationalists. But it has also attracted a lot of interest among evangelicals in the United States and among other conservatives. And this is really interesting and important, and I think really central to the strength of the responsibility to protect in the past and to the ability to make it an enduring part of American foreign policy into the future. Why has it had this cross-ideological perspective? Not only because it's anodyne, everybody is against genocide, but because it embraces some principles which are principles that Americans like to believe they associate with. Dick Cooper talked about the right to life. I would put it in Jeffersonian terms and talk about it as the right to live. And one of the things the responsibility to protect says is that the right of individuals to live is a more important right than the right of states to do as they please. And in this sense, the adoption of the responsibility to protect in 2005 by the General Assembly was really a major turning point in the international system, which, if pursued seriously, begins to resolve the tension in the UN's founding and before between the rights of the individual and the rights of states. Now I'll say something that's a little bit more controversial, and I'm going to try to wrap myself in the banner of Kofi Annan in an effort to give myself some defense. I also think that what the responsibility to protect says, notwithstanding the fact that everybody believes that it's better if these kinds of actions take place through the Security Council, I think the responsibility to protect says that there are also higher values than Security Council approval. Particularly when it comes to a circumstance like mass atrocities. Obviously, working through the Security Council is preferable, but I wouldn't say it's the only circumstance in which a response is justified. And now I will do the cowardly thing and quote somebody else with much greater stature than mine, Kofi Annan, who said, the choice must not be between council unity and inaction in the face of genocide, as in the case of Rwanda on the one hand, and council division and, and regional action, as in the case of Kosovo on the other. Now, Kofi Annan is not endorsing, I'm not saying he's endorsing unilateral action in this, but I think he is talking about the fact that process cannot trump justice in these cases. And I think that the responsibility to protect, even though the report itself does not endorse unilateral action, does place a much higher value on the ends in this case rather than the process that you get there. And I would interpret it as leaving open the option, if all else fails, to take action outside the Security Council if necessary. And my own view is if you had to do that, it's much better with a very broad group of states and with as much international legitimacy and buy-in as possible. I will just tick off a couple of things that happened in the American political context which were surprising. I had the privilege of working on a report mandated by Congress called the United Nations and U.S. Interests. The co-chairs of this report were Senator George Mitchell, liberal Democrat, and Newt Gingrich, the former conservative Speaker of the House and potentially presidential candidate, notwithstanding his personal peccadillos. And and I ended up working very closely with both Senator Mitchell and Speaker Gingrich on this report, and helping them to write it and to get consensus. And a lot of people expected this report to focus on UN management issues, just, you know, better accounting, independent auditing functions, oil for food, things like that. But what they decided to do, and a number of us encouraged them to do this, but they were very willing, was they decided to make the reform of ideas the centerpiece of this report, in addition to these other things. And they endorsed the responsibility to protect. Now, not in the exact language of the responsibility to protect report, or not as strong, I would say, as what the outcome document also accepted, but nonetheless a surprisingly clear endorsement of the concept. And that was notwithstanding very significant opposition within the task force, which had a very, very diverse and broad representation along the lines that, exactly along the lines that Ramesh described in his presentation, which was on the one hand, those who were concerned that the responsibility to protect created a new legal obligation for the United States, which it might not want to carry out, and those who, on the other hand, believed that the responsibility to protect would limit American freedom of action and scope of action. But notwithstanding this, they adopted this, and that actually, I think, behind the scenes in the U.S. government had an important impact on the complicated role the United States played in the UN in the outcome document. And Heidi has said in another forum that the fact that the United States was not out front as the main champion of the responsibility to protect probably helped. That was not a deliberate strategy, I don't think, by the United States. I think it reflected genuine ambivalence inside the administration. But there are, within the administration, probably even including the President of the United States, to the degree to which he's been engaged in this issue, of support for this concept. I have to end. I will not tell you what I was supposed to, which was what my recommendations would be for the future, but I will make an effort to do so in the Q&A. I will just end on one final note, which is that in thinking about how to advocate for this proposal, I would encourage all of us to not be afraid of difference, which at least in particular, I think internationally as well as in the context of the United States, because there is a lot of interest and support for this among communities that don't normally like each other, sit at the same table with one another, or work together. I'm thinking in particular the evangelical community, which distinguishes itself from the religious right wing, which sees this as a very important issue, at least to the degree that they've engaged on this issue. Tori?
We're just a little wedged in there, so I thought I would stand up. Thank you very much to the organizers of this conference for bringing in all of you and the incredible speakers who have gone before me and also will continue on for the rest of the next day and a half. I'm going to be shifting this conversation a little bit, and I might be doing exactly what Lee doesn't want, which is talk about what does it mean to send in the Marines. But let me first explain why, and I'm a bit here following on the comments of General Dallaire, Gareth Evans, and the much referred to Heidi Hewlin, whose fault it is for asking me some hard questions in 2004, which continue to bother me today and led to the book that's been mentioned, and we do have a copy out front. I didn't bring enough to give out, but if anyone would like a copy. This is a study we did on what does it mean to operationalize the responsibility to protect. I should briefly say the Stimson Center is a think tank. We're in Washington, D.C. We do research and analysis, but then we also go out and do what we call outreach, which is we actually have the nerve to try and change policy. And that's one of our major ambitions. So briefly here, let me talk about a number of things. I'm going to describe the research we've done into what does it mean to operationalize responsibility protect, which includes both the research and then a recent workshop we did in Ghana, where we brought in former force commanders and mission leaders who had served in 6 areas where, if it wasn't exactly genocide, large numbers of civilians came under direct physical threat from violence. And I could talk briefly about that. But let me just back up and say, we've talked today about how Responsibility Protect is a major agenda of prevention, reaction, and rebuild. I won't go back over the history of Responsibility Protect. And I have deep respect and desire to always have prevention work. That's our goal. But unfortunately, time and again, we see that it falls short. So until we figure out prevention, we also need to know what does reaction mean. And there seems to be a general assumption that you can just send in military folks, and they at least know what to do. And my argument here today is many of them do, but we have not prepared them adequately, and we risk having ad hoc responses on the ground yet again fail protection of civilians, both on a large scale and on a small scale. I'm going to focus on basically talking about prevention of prevention of violence against civilians in 2 scenarios. We originally took the study on to look at what does a genocide intervention force look like? What are the lessons learned from past? And you quickly realize this is no longer an active debate in one sense, because we're already sending in peacekeeping forces around the world. There's roughly 80,000 uniformed UN military, police, and civilians serving on the ground for the UN today. Over roughly 60,000 of them serve under mandates to protect civilians under imminent threat. And they do so with Chapter 7 mandates and the authority to use force. So it's not exactly just a philosophical debate. We already have people on the ground who are being asked to do this. And if you think the peace operations aren't exactly genocide prevention, that's a fair point. But quickly go back to Rwanda and see what the general described to us earlier, that he was on the ground leading a force that suddenly had a genocide on its hands. We know that most genocides are planned. So more likely than not, it's expected there will be some effort already on the ground trying to stem violence when on their watch something kicks up. So we need to know how those forces, and this also feeds into civilian thinking, are prepared for this. So I'm going to briefly touch on a couple things. What are the concepts of protection? Who are we talking about and what are they expected to do? How prepared are they? And then briefly, if I have time, I'll talk about the U.S. side, which I probably won't, but I will try. I'm a former congressional staffer, and we're used to briefing the members of Congress in an elevator ride from the 7th to the 1st floor, and that's it. So, to go quickly. So we did an investigation, and we said, all right, what are the basic concepts for the military to protect civilians? 2 obvious ones, I think, okay, I'll go shoot bad guys. I said, that's not exactly what we're always thinking about. Or second, it's the Geneva Conventions. I uphold the rule of law. I protect civilians on the way to my other goal. Neither of those exactly tell you what, if you're a military commander, it means to stop genocide. Okay, how about from the humanitarian community, which has a rich and deep literature and experience of protecting civilians? We gave a whole conference on this. I'm glad OCHA is here for this. Many of those ideas cannot be just picked up and dropped on an operation that involves military actors. Why? One of the main ones is protection of civilians through humanitarian space. Most peacekeeping is designed to support a political goal, to support a political process. They're there to help bolster elections, support a peace agreement, give support to the rule of law, and help the humanitarian community do its job. But what they don't usually do is get in the way to physically provide the protection themselves when civilians come under direct threat. So groups like Oxfam have talked about reducing vulnerability of civilians in IDP camps and refugee camps. If they're trying to collect water or firewood, you don't want them attacked on the way to doing their daily tasks. But that doesn't tell me, if I'm leading a peace operation, what I myself do with my troops. I can support that effort, but if suddenly a village is being overrun, or militia are raiding a town, or refugees are showing up on my base camp, what do I do on a daily basis? All right, so these are the rough concepts. What we really looked at was either what for a peace operation does this mean as a task or a major task or a peacekeeping mission, or how would you design a mission whose sole goal it was to stop genocide? Do we have any examples of this? Very, very few. There's been some military interventions such as the French-led Artemis in eastern Congo in the summer of 2003. They went and secured one town. There's some good lessons learned there. But in general, we don't know what this looks like to stop genocide. We don't have an off-the-shelf genocide prevention force ready to go. Okay, really quickly, 5 organizations that have their own authority to use force to intervene. We think we know them pretty well. NATO, the European Union, the African Union, ECOWAS, which is the Economic Community of West African States in West Africa, and the United Nations. All but one of them, only NATO itself, designs its own doctrine for peace support operations. The others are civilian-led organizations that have evolved to use force and be able to provide peacekeeping missions. Again, I could get into in the Q&A their actual capacities in each of these areas. Each has some capacity to deploy force. They have limited capacities, such as with the AU and ECOWAS, to do peace building, but we all know that their own authorities, such as the Constitutive Act for the African Union, allow them to send in forces to protect civilians under imminent threat or in a genocidal situation. Now, when militaries go in, they usually use some key tools to prepare themselves for the missions they anticipate. So what kind of tools are we talking about? They expect to have mandates, they expect to have rules of engagement, they expect to have doctrine, and hopefully they've got some training on what they're supposed to do on the ground. We know from the mandates that the UN's been passing that we've had almost a dozen missions now that have been asked to protect civilians under imminent threat. We also know the African Union has this mission in Darfur, ECOWAS in Cote d'Ivoire. So this is a very real question. But how is that actually translated? What do the civilian people mean when they come out of the Security Council, our political leaders? How does that translate to the special representative of the Secretary General if it's the UN? How does that then transition down to a force commander, the police commissioner? How do they work with the humanitarian community on the ground? And what, if I'm deployed from Malawi, Uruguay, or the United States, does it mean to me as a troop commander or as a troop myself? Am I being asked to put my life on the line? Now, in mandates, we usually have a couple caveats. They usually says protect civilians within your capacity, within your vicinity or area of deployment, with all due respect to the government of X. Why the last piece? Because sovereignty has not been crossed in most of these cases. Those 3 points have yet to be regularized and defined by the Council or by key actors. Doctrine, we can talk about doctrine. It's basically the guidance that have come out of lessons learned in past experiences. There's wonderful doctrine on peace support operations. I could find almost no evidence of anything that directly talked about what it means to protect civilians on the ground. It's deep in the humanitarian, human rights community. It talks about working with civilian government, excellent, important things, but doesn't give direct guidance. Only a few nations are even in this area. The UK and Canada has begun to develop some strategic level guidance, but is yet to evolve into specific doctrine that has been adapted, say, for example, by the United Nations, NATO, the European Union, or the African Union, or ECOWAS, although the UN and others are working on it. Real quick, training's important. Training usually derives from doctrine, however. We go through the cycle again. The UN is developing better standards, but where this all comes out with is we don't yet have good evidence that whether it's a peace operation that's already deployed or an imaginary future force that we want to see to go in to actually intervene when prevention has failed and genocide, crimes against humanity, or mass violence is happening, we do not see that this has been worked through, that we've had simulations, that we have military leaders who can advise political and civilian leaders what they need to do the job and what it means. Now, our workshop in Ghana basically, unfortunately, reinforced a lot of these points. There's a lot of ideas about protection. Is it a physical protection of a camp? Is it policing a road? Is it going after the bad guys actively? And in the Congo, you've seen all these examples led by the UN. They finally figured out how to do this better. Everything from giving pots and pans to local villages so they can bang on them, so the Pakistanis and the Indian forces nearby will be alerted and can show up and help provide support. Or it also means they're actually using attack helicopters and other aspects to go after the bad guys when they are provoked. All right, well, let me move quickly to U.S. options. there's a lot of arguments from the West that, look, either we don't need to do this because we're not ever going to do these missions, or we already know how to do it, or that's really a humanitarian issue. And I would argue that, given what we experienced in Ghana, the force commanders who had served, we had the deputy force commander in Rwanda, we had force commanders from the Congo and from Sierra Leone, and the deputy from Kosovo, and the leader of the UN mission into East Timor, and 201, they said we did not have guidance on what we were supposed to do vis-a-vis the protection of civilians. These were all smart people. It didn't mean they failed. Many of them did a fabulous job. But what it means is that they used the skills they came with to do the best job they could. And frequently that was not enough, and they are frustrated by that. It gets to capacity, but it gets to guidance. So I would argue that the United States, among other things, could help move this forward. We don't have to drop everything and put all our resources into this. Already, the 5 organizations I mentioned are building better capacities. They're developing doctrine and guidance. They're doing their own training. They're sorting this out. So all we need to do is get inside those systems. And it won't be too hard. The Ghana workshop showed me we've already got someone who tried to draft some guidance for NATO. The UN is working on guidance itself. A number of the military people came up to me afterward and said, I will help you. That's not why you invited me to this conference, but we want to fix these tools. Because these are the tools that countries usually turn to. So I would say that the U.S., even if we're not the ones who are going to be sending in forces, could do a huge, huge favor to the world by helping develop these toolkits, because they're the ones that are borrowed by all these other organizations. When we support the African Union in Darfur, they may turn to us and say, well, what do you mean by this? Can you help us with capacity, but can you give us guidance about what we do at that checkpoint, or what we do at that refugee camp, or how we, if we do engage bad guys, what does that mean? So I would argue that. We could also talk more about the capacity for peace operations to function. The U.S. is headed into a challenging area. The administration has supported the largest increase in UN peacekeeping in its history. We're looking at way over 100,000 troops in the coming year, and budgets approaching over $1.5 billion for the United States. So will Congress be able to come up with the money for this? And will we also put up funds and support for other reform efforts, so that the next time we send in peacekeepers, whether they be civilian or military leaders, they know what it means to protect civilians on the ground? Thank you.
I just wanted to add one comment, and I've actually never told this story before, but when I was about to take over the African portfolio in 1994, I asked my predecessor, where am I going to have to focus attention immediately? Where are the possible blow-up points? And my predecessor walked through a number of different countries, and she did not say Rwanda. And I said, well, what about Rwanda? And she said, don't worry, there's a peace process there, and we've got a UN peacekeeping force on the ground. And that answer, I did not challenge. I obviously should have. But what it said to me in retrospect is, we assume that because the UN has a peacekeeping force on the ground, that they can serve the multiple purposes that we're requiring of them, not only to implement a peace process, but, as Tori said, to stop a genocide. And the truth was, Romeo Dallaire is a remarkable man, but his force was not designed to do that, and frankly couldn't do it.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be invited to this conference as a representative of the Japanese National Diet, and to be included among the distinguished experts in this panel. It's very hard to follow what Tori has just presented, but actually I'm going to elaborate a little more on how this reactive phase of the R2P, responsibility to protect, is causing what kind of response in Japan is being formed by this. And of course, and also I will touch briefly on what kind of effects changes in U.S. defense policy recently has been affecting Japan's defense policy as well, and in terms of what how foreign policies shaped along with these changes. Surprisingly, in Japan, the concept of responsibility to protect, or the acronym R2P, is virtually unknown or unpopular to the general public, not mentioning the legislators, policymakers, academics, or even the activists. Experts in the field of post-conflict peacebuilding and DDR, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration such as officials from the Foreign Ministry and officers of the UN and other international organizations, however, do. In fact, they know maybe too well. Their focused global perspective of experts tend to deviate from the more generalized, internalized perspective of the rest of the public. So the idea of responsibility to protect simply has not sold well in Japan. Why? You might wonder, considering that Japan has remained a pacifist nation for the last 60 years without ever immersing itself to an armed conflict with another sovereign state. You might wonder why the Japanese people, who have worked hard to maintain the pacifist ideology, has virtually no interest in the idea of the international community as a whole having the responsibility to protect people who are confronted with threats to their existence, welfare, and dignity. The reason for this is actually quite simple, but it's also double-sided. The one side of the argument is that half of these people cannot visualize a concept being undertaken without the use of force. But the whole idea of the R2P is that the principle of non-intervention yields to the international responsibility to protect, even if it requires the use of limited force to avert a situation that place people under grave harm or risk. So why is the R2P still deemed as something that would take place without the use of force? Because the strong ideology of force being unnecessary or even detrimental to the maintenance of peace limits their scope, that any means of peacekeeping that require or necessitate the use of force to any degree is unacceptable and not worth considering. What lies behind this very generalized and limited perception of peace is a history of Japan's post-war development, which is underscored by rapid economic and social development without ever engaging in an armed conflict. Many of these people, including some legislators, believe that peace and development could only be achieved through absolute pacifism, meaning that no means that connote otherwise should be utilized to achieve or maintain peace. These people pride themselves over the achievement and are determined that Japan has taken the right path of development. The notion of responsibility, in their word, is taken differently as a responsibility to maintain harmony. It's called wa in Japanese, and refrain from disrupting the social equilibrium, either nationally or internationally. They believe maintaining wa is of utmost importance to avert hostilities, and that Japan should maintain its position as a pacifist nation and continue to refrain from resorting to force, regardless of the consequence of its inaction. The other side of the spectrum, however, sees the world in a much narrower way. The other half of the Japanese people believes that peace for Japan can be achieved better if Japan maintains its own military and protects itself from the threats within and from abroad. These people believe that Japan can contribute in maintaining international peace and security through developing the capacity to dispatch troops on call. They believe that their solution to reform the pacifist constitution to become an ordinary state is not only practical, but the only way for Japan to become a responsible player in world affairs. The international community may think, you may think, that this other half of the Japanese people are more internationally minded and are willing to participate in peacekeeping efforts that may in some cases require the use of force, limited force. Unfortunately, this is not the case either. They only perceive the use of force as necessary in protecting their own interests and livelihood, and participating in international peace processes as credits to their deeds. International recognition is their goal. Paradoxically, however, these people also cannot perceive the concept of R2P being undertaken without the use of force. They believe that only the use of force would act as effective means to maintaining its own peace and security, owing to a Hobbesian way of thinking that the use of force is the only universal language recognized by all state actors, and that is how world peace is maintained. So what is the problem here? The problem is that both of the perspectives lack a deep understanding of the concept that peace requires a balanced mix of military and non-military approach. One cannot and shall not rule out the other. Kenji Isezaki, a well-known DDR field expert in Japan, also acknowledges that when it comes to understanding the concept of the use of force or any military means in the context of building and maintaining peace, the understanding of ordinary Japanese people is at its best limited or are non-existent. He argues that not only the general public, but even the policymakers in the Diet, which I represent, and the press are simply ill-equipped with the knowledge to effectively discuss on the issue, to help cast light on the more pertinent issues, such as the legal consequences of dispatching troops into a foreign territory. In an interview with a web magazine that was released last week, Professor Isazaki cited the situation in the war against Iraq. He argued that none of the opposition, the policymakers, academics, the civil society, or the media ever raised the issue of dispatching the troops without ensuring them the legal and physical protection that any foreign troops in the coalition would enjoy. The Japanese Self-Defense Force could not enjoy this because we were not deploying the forces under UN protection. So this is the average extent of what contributed to peace is in Japan. For many, peace is a matter of principle and not substance. In a world divided with such simplistic mindsets, an in-depth debate on the sophisticated concept of R2P is not easily forthcoming. This general trend is not only visible in the public, but in the ministerial level too, in the bureaucracy. Just a few weeks ago, at the end of February, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs hosted an open symposium on human rights and democracy. The title of the symposium was Towards Arc of Freedom and Prosperity. It was Japan's renewed approach in foreign diplomacy that was announced by Foreign Minister Aso on November 2006. This renewed policy focused on value-oriented diplomacy that upholds universal values such as democracy, freedom, human rights, and the rule of law. And this arc of freedom and prosperity, which stretches throughout Eurasia but does not include the conflict-ridden African continent. So the symposium gave the ministry the opportunity to follow up on Ministry Aso's announcement. So this signifies Japan's most current approach towards human security issues. It was in 1999 when Prime Minister Obuchi proposed the establishment of a UN trust fund for human security as a way to implement their central policy objectives of human-centered foreign diplomacy. After 8 years, the word human security disappeared from the Japan's central foreign policy agenda. Instead, we see the terms like freedom and prosperity as a centerpiece of the renewed banner in an international conference addressing Japan's human rights diplomacy. There you can see how U.S. is influencing Japan's diplomatic stance there. But it's not only the title of the conference, of course, it was that mattered. The conference gathered experts from various fields, such as the special advisor to the rector of the UN University, and representative from the civil organization, and even a Supreme Court judge from the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia. The panel was chaired by the newly appointed ambassador in charge of human rights from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. In other words, this specific panel gathered experts from the UN, the civil society, international organization, and the bureaucracy all in one place. However, interventions by the ministry officials downgraded the principle of R2P to a mere concept and stressed the importance of a preventive, proactive approach rather than a reactive one. But please don't get me wrong. I may have sounded like I regard the R2P as something that would always require the use of force. But I do not disagree that a proactive and preventive approach is essential to put R2P in practice. I simply cannot concede to the optimism that a non-military approach would serve as the ultimate solution to all humanitarian crises. My impression of the discussion was that all speakers acknowledged the significance of military readiness to a reactive approach, and yet they somehow refrained from mentioning the effectiveness of it. The reason is that such debate will inevitably bring forth I'm going to the conclusion, sorry. This is actually the important part because when you talk about Japan, you can't let out the constitution. So the reason is that such debate will inevitably bring forth the argument that in order for Japan to effectively act on its obligations set forth under the principle of R2P, they would have to concede with the current administration, the Abe administration's conditioned argument that changing the Constitution to allow a wider role for the self-defense force will be necessary. Okay, so I have to finish it here, but my conclusion is that the simplistic mindset of the general public is really affecting the policymakers' minds and what they can actually speak in public. And at the same time, actually, there's a very cautious movement in the defense community, which I think I would elaborate later if there's any question on it. Thank you very much.
So any of us who thought that this was a hard sell in the United States, I think should take an object lesson here. Hans-Jörg?
Thank you. I actually have to worry about my own protection at the moment because I'm sitting on edge here, about to fall off the podium. And also, after having watched the lady here in the front, who undoubtedly has the most difficult job, I'm already afraid of the time. So I'm just going to make one point on the overall concept of protection of civilians, and then jump right to one of the conclusions that I was going to present. We've been talking a lot about the use of force. I think it would be fatal to just reduce the concept of the protection of civilians to the use of force. It is important, and the reason why we discuss the use of force so much within this concept is that it's the most contentious and the most dangerous in terms of perception and backlash for the international community. But perhaps you allow me to recap a little bit on where we started, actually, on the protection of civilians. Protection is not a new phenomenon. The ICRC and UNHCR have been doing very specific mandated protection ever since their inception, the 40s and the 50s. They dealt with refugees, they dealt with legal protection, they dealt with prisoners, and so on and so forth. But I think what is new in the debate is the comprehensive approach that we're all taking to the protection of civilians. And I think you've seen sort of a selection of the themes here. The protection of civilians, and that has started in the early 90s, is a comprehensive concept, an umbrella concept, as we say, that comprises human rights protection, that comprises the political approaches, peace mediation, and ultimately peace processes leading to peace resolution. It comprises the humanitarian element, sustaining the mere survival of entire populations, as we see right now in Darfur, for as long as it is necessary, until more security and political processes can kick in, and development at the tail end. What happened in the early 90s was we've had refugee movements, we've had violence before, people got killed before, but on an unprecedented basis, we had intrastate conflicts after the Cold War, after the old order sort of fell apart. We've seen, I have it somewhere here, I think 121 armed conflicts ever since the beginning of the 90s. As we speak about this concept, we still have 30 actively ongoing conflicts. And most of them are intrastate, communities attacking each other. And what happened there is that I think politically, because of the sovereignty issue, militarily, because it requires a very different doctrine and very different equipment and very different type of peacekeeping to intervene in a civil conflict from the interstate conflict that we have seen before. And the Iraq discussion right now in this country bears witness on how difficult it is to interact in between communities. What it has seen is unbelievable atrocities between communities, unbelievable levels of displacement within countries being witnessed, epidemic levels of sexual violence. And I have to ask for forgiveness. It's not only a gender issue, it is a core protection issue. What is happening is that sexual violence is used across the board against women and against men, and against boys, and against girls, to whoever holds the social fabric of a community together will be a target of sexual violence, because it erodes the social fabric. It undermines the self-coping mechanisms of communities, particularly when they, relatively intact, move from their home communities into IDP camps. This is the target, this is the purpose of sexual violence. It's far beyond being a gender issue. We still have, to this day, 250,000 children serving as child soldiers around the world. So it's the amounts of intrastate protection needs that have actually, jointly with what occurred then in Bosnia and in Kosovo and in Rwanda, prompted the international community relatively unanimously to say, we need to know more. What's happening there? The Secretary General delivered a landmark report in '97 on the situation in Africa. It was more or less the first report ever that comprehensively looked at the different features of conflict, from displacement through the proliferation of small arms, to the situation in camps, sexual violence, and everything that I mentioned, landmines. So this is all that is sort of covered by this umbrella of protection of civilians in conflict. These are all the challenges that we have to face. And this led, thanks to the Canadian presidency in the Security Council, in 1999, in February of '99, to a presidential statement of the Canadian presidency of the Security Council at the time, requesting the Secretary General to present to the Security Council, for the first time ever, a report on the situation of civilians in armed conflict, and make specific recommendations as to how to improve the situation of civilians. This is a watershed, because what happened just a month after this opportunity, the Council had decided upon this opportunity, is that the Kosovo War, the Kosovo conflict started. And we saw, again, 1.1 at the height million displaced within this tiny exclave of Kosovo, caught within their own borders. There is no access. There is no access for humanitarians. There is no security. And the international community stands by with many more TV cameras, with much more visibility than we ever had before. And I think these are all important contributing factors to this momentum that has built up and led to 5 reports on the protection of civilians until now. It led to 3 thematic resolutions on the protection of civilians. One, the most recent one, 1674, now also frequently referenced the R2P principle, and is now referenced, for example, in 1706, Resolution 1706 on Darfur. In the wake of this, a lot has happened. We have many more NGOs today operating in conflict situations than we ever had in the 90s. We have in Darfur alone 14,000 humanitarian workers, 14,000 humanitarian workers providing a measure of protection every day by their mere presence in these conflicts, working on firewood collection to prevent the rape of women, working on post-traumatic and prevention issues to avoid this, working on organizing the camps, registering IDPs, redressing legal issues, the whole gamut of issues that I outlined before. This is happening every day on the ground. However, this is only a band-aid. Humanitarian activity is never the solution. And in fact, I know that many of these things happen in parallel, but when people see the suffering of people, the first thing they say is, my God, these people need shelter, they need food, they need water, they need some medical treatment, they need to be, the dead and injured need to be tended to. So the first question that always arises is, do we have access? How do we get access? Negotiations with governments set in. So although we may not be able to prevent conflict or the outbreak of conflict, but it's important to realize that even within ongoing conflict, there are many opportunities, soft and hard, before we come to the threshold of actually sending in the Marines, of protecting civilians in a very pragmatic way. Now, who is responsible within the United Nations system? It's something perhaps that we can bring out a bit more in the discussion, in the Q&As. It's a very difficult discussion. It has to do with the incoherence of the United Nations system. In my view, the responsibility to protect is and must be owned by the Secretary General himself. He is the guardian of this international principle. He represents the collective humanity that underpins this principle. Perhaps one thing, and again we can go into the details perhaps in the Q&As, one thing as a reality check. I think it's easy and good and important to talk in these fora, but most of us, as someone said before, are liberal, or as we would say in Europe, leftist internationalists. So we all talk to each other. But what is important is that we look at what still needs to be done. It would be a disaster if this important opportunity of the responsibility to protect just became another rhetorical platform, just another rallying cry for those who are already like-minded. No, it has to be something that starts something new. And I'm afraid this new is going to take a long time and a lot of patience. And a Middle Eastern wise man once said, if you want to go fast, go slow. So I think what we need to focus on is, in addition to clarifying the concept and focusing on further normative developments, we need to do some serious constituency building. And if you give me one more minute, I'll just say what I mean. We have a number of like-minded member states, and you probably have in the course of today, you've heard the countries Canada, the United Kingdom, the United States, Europe, very often. But we haven't heard Pakistan, India, Egypt, and so on and so forth. But they matter. They matter a lot. And what we see right now is, and that's what we have to prevent, is that the concept becomes devalidated or delegitimized by simply allowing those countries to mobilize the entirety of the G77 and those who don't exactly focus on this discussion as much as we do, because we focus on development and other issues, to label this agenda as simply another Western interventionist agenda. That is why it is important not only to reduce it to the use of force, but to actually really go identify opinion leaders in regional groups like Argentina, like Jordan, and so on, who from within those groups can over years work on changing attitudes. It's important that NGOs do the bottom-up civil society lobbying. Much more needs to happen, and I'm coming to the end. Much more needs to happen on that front, because the disaster would be if the G77 within the General Assembly were to become an en bloc anti-R2P fraction. I think this would be, for many years to come, the paralysis, if not the end of the whole concept. Thank you.
I think what you've seen is a representation of the power of the blue note that's been passed from person to person, because all of our panelists had more to say. And I'm struck by the difference between the panel this morning and this panel, in the sense that we're trying to get into some of the very tough issues that Gareth was describing before as the next agenda. How do you operationalize this? How do you sell it within governments? How do you get militaries trained up to do this? How do you take it overseas and talk about it within the Japanese context? How do you operationalize it within the UN context? And so the sense of rallying, the sense of excitement that came from that first panel is measured against the reality of the pragmatism of this panel. And so I'm intrigued in terms of, I think we have about 20 minutes. If we could get into some of those questions, I think it would be interesting. Please.
Yeah, I've, like many of you, worked in post-conflict situations in Bosnia, Kosovo, Rwanda, and others. And I was taken by Tori's comment about prevention, reaction, and rebuilding. And so much attention always focuses on military intervention, early intervention. So it goes back to the old medical concepts of primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention. What bothers me is when does responsibility to protect end? And it has to do with operationalizing the whole process of rebuilding. Because once you've gotten to rebuilding, you're actually back again to prevention. And the problem has been, for example, in Rwanda, where an authoritarian government has basically stepped up human rights. And we're all back there saying, gee, we couldn't stop him in '94. But in a sense, we are still not protecting people in the country. We have seen situations, we're sort of talking about the wonderful increase in the number of NGOs working in the field. My experience has been a lot of NGOs tripping over each other who are working separately from other development people, working separately from the United Nations, leaving out whole segments of what's required to rebuild a society. And yet, if we are really talking about prevention and protection of civilians, it's a question of how operationalizing the rebuilding process is very critical. I wonder if any of you have any comments on that.
Well, I'm going to respond very quickly. We talked about the Peace Building Commission, and I really truly believe that this is an important development. Yes, Gareth is right that it's more in the promise than in the reality so far. But this is an institution that was started just about a year ago that is drawing together all the elements not only of the United Nations, but also the World Bank, donor communities, but most importantly, the countries themselves and the civil society elements, and drawing them together to say, our society has just gone through the equivalent of post-traumatic stress syndrome. It has failed. It has fallen apart. For some reason, we now have the chance to put it back together again, whether it's Sierra Leone or Burundi or the Democratic Republic of the Congo or Guinea or any of these societies. What is it going to take in terms of rebuilding confidence of individuals in their government, rebuilding the social contract that links government and people, and protecting the individuals in that society? The process is just getting off the ground, but it's fairly promising in terms of Sierra Leone and Burundi, the two places they've taken on now. So watch this space. Tori?
Just a quick thought. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, you prevent by rebuilding properly, but it's matching the vision of what rebuilding is to the capacity. And if you look at UN mandates or peace operations actually mostly go in after the conflict's been awful, and they go in and try and rebuild. And those UN mandates have been expanding amazingly. I mean, if you look, it's good that there's a recognition of all that needs to be done. But as Don just pointed out, the resources aren't usually lined up right behind it, and that's a challenge to member states. If we're serious, a lot of this has to come through bilateral support and aid and better capacity for the UN Secretariat so they can do all the things that the member states say they want it to do.
You talked about the cyclical nature of peace building becoming prevention. Unfortunately, one of the things that happened in the negotiations that led up to the outcome document is that the Peace Building Commission originally was envisioned to have a role not only post-conflict, but in places where there was a risk of conflict, but conflict hadn't happened, and that was lost in the sauce, unfortunately.
There's been a lot of talk of use of the military, hopefully as a last resort. Could someone address whether there has been consideration of using nonviolence in the vein of Gandhi's idea of a peace army, using unarmed forces to go in for both peacekeeping and peacemaking? And there are some organizations like Peace Workers, witness groups that do similar work, although not developed for a mass scale because they don't have the financing.
You're looking at the only guy who's not wearing a tie, that's why.
Only guys that
It's only because I lost my luggage this morning, otherwise I would be here like everyone else. But no, look, I I think we have to be realistic and look what is happening in most of these places. I'm all for peaceful means, and where we can exhaust them, we should. However, let's take the example of, Rwanda has been talked about probably a lot today. I think most of the genocide happened within, 10, 12 days? A lot of the killing, no peaceful force on this planet would have stopped this at this point. We've now tried in Darfur. I was the chief of staff of the peacekeeping operation from mid-2004 to mid-2005. We've tried now for 3 years everything possible. I think at the end of the day, what we have right now is a situation where out of 6 million people in Darfur, 2 million are displaced in camps under daily threat of violence, 2 million are affected around those camps, and 2 million are still in their little hamlets and villages in daily anticipation of attacks. Banditry, everything is rife. There comes a point when the most peaceful means are exhausted. So I'm not saying, with everything, despite everything that I said before, that one shouldn't reduce R2P to just the use of force. But this being said, it has to be part of the equation. And that is why I think what we have to, it's a mix of things. And we may have situations, and that's the critical thing, where we may never have the luxury of inserting a peacekeeping troop. We have situations in northern Uganda where all you have is humanitarian assistance, peaceful means, mediating and negotiating on a daily basis. We've seen this for many years now in Somalia happening. So at the end of the day, it's a mix between all these things. But as much as I support non-violent humanitarian means and so on, the umbrella concept that I mentioned before is a concept that has to look at all the tools and exhaust all the tools at the right time. Political mediation, humanitarian assistance, military means if necessary, albeit as a means of last resort. And of course, you wouldn't expect anything else from me to say within the context of the Security Council and development, of course.
You have just mentioned the Security Council. Unfortunately, it appears that the Security Council is held hostage by a gang of five who have the veto power to protect their national interests and the interests of their entire state. So how do we go around that situation in which a lot of issues will not be addressed because somebody will veto it?
Is that me? Yeah. So I think you're identifying a problem, but from a very different perspective from the way I was describing it. But I think your point is very valid. Look, I think you want to prioritize the Security Council wherever possible and as much as possible, particularly when you have an instance of humanitarian intervention, because people's motives will be questioned. People's motives will be mixed, and also because you need as much cooperation as possible to sustain an operation, to make it effective, to have enough capacity in the first place, and to keep it going as long as you need to keep it going in order for it to be worth the sacrifice. And the Security Council and the General Assembly are kind of, a bargain a little bit in the U.S. context, like the House of Representatives and the Senate. Not exactly the same thing, but basically it was a bargain. And the UN wouldn't operate effectively if you had a system of one country, one vote. And that's why you have something like the Security Council, which operates in some senses unfairly. It's kind of a discriminatory system in order to create some efficiency. The problem we face, I think Ramesh said this very dramatically earlier, is that the Security Council is can't possibly be perfectly representative, but it is far from representative of current power and other realities, and that has an effect on its legitimacy. And fixing that problem is a lot harder than stating it, however.
Let me respond as well and put it in the context of some recent actions that the Security Council has taken. When you look back in April of last year, the Security Council did a very effective job in pushing the process in Darfur ahead by passing a resolution that essentially made some very major threats there. And the reason that that was possible is Tanzania, Ghana, and the Congo-Brazzaville, the 3 elected members of Africa, stood together and basically went to the Russians and went to the Chinese and said, you are not going to defend the government in Khartoum when we are telling the government of Khartoum as Africans that they are embarrassing the African continent. And it was a powerful message that was sent. Skip forward about 5 months, and the United States decided they would try to do a quick fix in Darfur and pass a resolution, 1706, that says, let's introduce this large peacekeeping force on the continent, and did it, what I believe was an effort to grandstand and to try to send the message that we're actually doing something here. They were told by the Russians, the Chinese, and the Qataris that they would not support that resolution. Americans decided to push it anyway. They did get it through, but those 3 countries abstained on the resolution. That sent a very powerful message to Khartoum, and literally 3 days later, Khartoum launched a major attack in Darfur because they knew that the Security Council was not united against them. Skip forward to what Gareth was talking about in January, where the United States tries to push through a resolution on Burma that was largely hortatory, but expanded the nature of what the Security Council is. Now, most of us believe that the Americans were entirely right in pushing that Burma has an awful human rights record and should be held to account. But an inability to sell that sent the exact same message when the Chinese, the Russians, and even the South Africans voted against that resolution. Desmond Tutu subsequently said, we have betrayed our history because of that. But we all knew that that's what was going to happen. And so if you don't use the Security Council smartly, as was done last April, you can end up in the situation that you've described.
Don, just on that point perhaps, I mean, I think you put a very important question. The question that I always return is what if it's not the Council, who decides then? And it may be unfair, but it's an important question in this, and it makes it a bit more conceptual. If you look at the outcome document of the Millennium Summit that we hail, Operative 138, 139, basically it suggests a 3-step approach, and he makes it very, very clear. And only on that basis did 191 member states agree. The first is the primary responsibility of each state to protect its civilians. Secondly, at the second step, international assistance to that state to fulfill its responsibility. And only once we have, and we don't even have clear nomenclature there yet, only once we have ascertained that it's inadequate or manifestly failing or there is no state action, then international action can substitute for that responsibility. Now, who determines that? What that means is that there is the individual willingness of the state to act upon its responsibility is replaced, or ought to be replaced by a collective will. Now, if it's not the Council, who else represents this collective will? And I think we have to be very careful, and I don't want to get into any Iraq or whatever discussions, but I think it is easy to muster support of 20, 30, 40 countries. Now, 3 or 4 years later, one would question whether that represented the collective will. I think we have to be very careful at that point who determines and based on what criteria when the collective will replaces the individual will. I'm not saying it shouldn't, and it should not under no circumstances be outside the Security Council. But I think it's very important because this is where we lose a lot of states, this is where we create paranoia, this is where we become intransparent, and this is where we, the West, may fall prey to our own interests in other situations, where the concept may actually be hijacked by our own supporters when it suits them. And so I just don't have any other answer than that.
And just to make sure that everyone understands this is not just the Bush administration essentially saying we're not going to hand over American prerogatives to the United Nations. This is a very strongly felt view that no automatic mechanism within the UN system will lead to the deployment of American forces. If you went to the average American and said, would you accept the fact that the Security Council passing a resolution can force the United States to intervene militarily either under the UN flag or elsewhere, you would never get support for that among the American people. I worked for Bill Clinton, as did Lee, as did Tory. Bill Clinton would not have supported that concept. Last question, please.
Anthony Dworkin, Director of the Crime Support Project. Hans-Jörg Strohmeyer talked about diplomatic initiatives as one aspect of the protection of civilians. And my question is how far, when you have crimes against humanity, genocide, mass war crimes taking place in the context of an armed conflict, as we do today in Darfur and as was the case in Bosnia, how much the notion of responsibility to protect should incorporate ideas of ending the armed conflict as a way of preventing harm to civilians, or whether we should try and leave those kind of political questions to one side and focus on the humanitarian emergency of ending mass atrocities against civilians. How far does it dilute the concept to incorporate kind of negotiations between warring parties, or how much is that an essential element of looking after the civilians involved?
Who wants to take that?
Well, I think if the question is, look, I interpret your question a little bit as is use of force a last resort, and I think the answer to that is no. I mean, there will be instances where you'd obviously not prefer to resort to force wherever possible, but there may be times where, and I would say the Darfur case may be one of those, where the Bashir government has broken so many promises over such a long period of time that while negotiations are part of the solution, you probably can't get negotiations without a credible threat of force, and there has yet to be a credible threat of force, or maybe even limited use of force.
Can I just interrupt? Should our goal in using force be to stop attacks on civilians, or to get into negotiating good faith?
But there are negotiations. Sorry, there. I think it doesn't happen that way. It's not that we divide these things up. I mean, in Bosnia, in Kosovo, in Darfur, there have been political negotiations all along. They just don't result in anything. And I think what we see very often is, as long as there is no stability in security terms, even if it's a stalemate, even if it's an insufficient peace, as we had in Bosnia, that long it will be very difficult. For that long, it will be very difficult to come to a political solution. So there is a certain sequencing, but I think all these things are pursued in parallel. I think one thing that I would like to caution against also, it's because of Kosovo, because of our impatience, it's so often that we talk about the use of force, meaning this famous humanitarian intervention. What Tori was talking about, peacekeeping and the adequate means to carry out peacekeeping, to be a force in between all the different parties, is an important aspect, sort of at the lower level of the use of force, or before the use of force, that enables stability and a secure environment. And I think going back to 2004, 2005, what I regret, as much as the African Union forces were never perfect, they were actually pretty good in 2004, early 2005. They were better than many of the UN forces that I've seen in different peacekeeping operations around the globe. However, I believe it's also part of the responsibility to protect. For those who have declared early on that they will not go into Sudan, genocide or not, and for those who know that this is our only ticket that we have there, to provide the adequate funding quickly enough and help with the fourth generation. Now, a lot of these things happened, but they happened too late or too little. And I'm not saying we would be somewhere very different, but I think in 2004, 2005, there was more opportunity than what we have right now. And so all of these things are small steps very often. The escalation doesn't always, like in Kosovo, require immediate humanitarian military intervention.
Tori?
I think a key part of Responsibly Protect, and while I focused on military and somewhat peacekeeping, is how when you know what operationally your options are, it better shapes what civilian diplomatic leadership can do. There's a lot of interest in a parallel world where you train diplomats, foreign service officers, people like Dawn in the future, to know what to look for on the ground. And this is important for a couple of reasons. That too often when peace agreements are reached, you don't have people in the room who know operationally what you can do. And one of the people in our Ghana workshop said, we showed up, we're told to create safe zones. What's a safe zone? You know, and he's still drawing on his napkin, trying to figure out how to make them work better next time, because they didn't know what that meant operationally. And it's not just safe zones. There's all kinds of ideas that maybe could feed a relationship between the diplomatic community and those you might deploy, whether they're traditional peacekeepers, Chapter 7 robust forces, or potential force that goes in expressly and solely to stop the physical violence against civilians. And we need to understand better what that scale is so that if you're the one negotiating a peace agreement, you can both threaten adequately and you can uphold what you argue you can do. So I think they're intrinsically linked.
Two final points. Please. Please.
It's phenomenal, the amount of discussion we've been having on use of force, and I don't see too many soldiers in the room. And I think it would be most pertinent, in fact, that we do have people from those institutions of higher learning of military establishments to be part of these debates and discussions and to be significant. Secondly, my mandate after 30 years of NATO, of simple lexicons of attack, defend, withdraw, and bypass, in 1993 was establish an atmosphere of security. What does establish mean? Do I defend the country when I'm demobilizing both armies against a third party? Do I watch? And what is an atmosphere of security? A police state, no weapons. And so a whole series of words and action verbs came down and continue to come down with no definition. And mostly that lexicon is not defined because there is no doctrine behind it. There is no conceptual base to the use of force, the diplomatic interfacing, the humanitarian, in an era where all this has got to be integrated. We haven't done that yet. We're fiddling with old stuff on the margins. And lastly, in regards to the U.S., I was in front of your Senate subcommittee on human rights a couple of weeks ago, and I've said it in many military institutions here in the United States. The last people I want on a mission with me are the Americans, because they attract a lot of problems, and they also, if they get a bloody nose, have had a tendency of pulling out. And if a major world power pulls out, like Somalia, what does that mean for the rest of us? It must be kept in reserve. And as I said at the committee, you are throwing yourselves in far too soon, and far too irresponsibly, I think, in a tricking your capability by going in and not forcing other peoples to carry the can. And middle powers and other countries should be doing a lot more. You stay in reserve, in overwatch, and if the thing goes to pot, then bring the overwhelming force capability that you have, under as an example the power doctrine. So stop fiddling and getting sucked in, and in fact risking the credibility of so many other capabilities that we could use if you were held in reserve. Thanks.
I want to make now 3 points very quickly. First, on behalf of the organizers, there was an attempt to bring in a number of military people. It just didn't work out. But there was an effort to, in fact, have a panel of military experts to talk about these aspects. I think Tori is very knowledgeable on this issue, and so that was partially a substitute. On the question... I actually didn't mean that the way I guess it sounded out. So, secondly, on the question of what you're looking for from R2P, I think, again, Darfur is very significant. Because when we say what we want from Bashir right now, yes, one of the key elements is to participate in a peace process that's actually going to conclude this. But at the same time, it is to provide humanitarian space for workers. It's to arrange a ceasefire. It's to let the rebel movements come together so that they represent a viable partner to negotiate. And certainly it is to stop the aerial bombardment. So it's not a sort of one or the other. And I just wanted to pick up on the final point that General Dallaire just made, and that was with regard to Somalia. And I wanted to tell just one last story, if I could. In March of 1994, went with President Clinton to Fort Drum, New York, which is the place where the Rangers came from who were trying to capture Adid and got involved in Black Hawk Down. And we went there because it was the ceremony for the final withdrawal of forces from Somalia. And Bill Clinton met privately with some of the family members of people who had served there. And one woman stood up at about halfway through and said, "Mr. President, what would you say to the family of a serviceman who died in Mogadishu?" And it was the only time I've ever seen Bill Clinton sort of fumble. And he said, "Well, I would tell them that I personally made mistakes, that I sent their sons and daughters into a situation where they couldn't handle what they were being faced with. It wasn't clear what our political mission was." And then another woman raised her hand and said, "Mr. President, with all due respect, I think you got it wrong. What you should say to that family is that your son or your daughter died a hero in the finest tradition of America by trying to save the lives of hundreds of thousands of Somalis." Americans and the president, to his honor, said, "You got it exactly right, and I will change my lexicon." I think that's important because I think we sometimes forget that there is a larger purpose for our actions, that it's not always about oil, and it's not always about territory, and it's not always about our geostrategic interests. It is about humanity. It does lead, saving the life of a Somali threatened with starvation or genocide is equally important as the cutting of a finger of an American, and then the Americans decide to leave. So I just wanted to leave you on that note.
Don, can I just one? No, I just wanted to pick up on 1 point, 30 seconds. I think in this whole discussion, R2P, it's something that does not only happen in Sudan and Somalia and elsewhere. And I think if we want to succeed with this principle, we have to look at our own credibility. And credibility also starts how we integrate and respect those protection concerns and human rights concerns in our own efforts on the war on terror, in our own campaigns in these countries. And I think this is a very important message that we're sending to others who we expect for all the right reasons to adhere to international standards.